We're going to keep moving through our brain here, and we're going to go a little bit further into what's going on in that diencephalon area. And the diencephalon is that center area of the brain. That's that animal brain, the mammal brain. And that's the part of the brain that's really responsible for learning and survival. So we learn how to avoid danger, and we do it at a very young age. You know, if you're walking across the street, if you hear a screeching tire, you're going to jump. Right? You've learned that that means that a car is coming, maybe going to hit you, or a horn, or anything like that. Our brains, you don't have to think about it. You just jump out of the way. And that's a perfect example of the limbic system, which is our system that's in place for emotion and memory, and essentially keeping us from getting in a bad situation. So let's talk a little bit about what is going on inside this really important limbic system. First of all, like I said, it's in the diencephalon. What's responsible for is using information coming in, sensory information comes into the brain, it goes to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus it gets channeled to this limbic system. And if you take a look at this diagram here, you can see there's a lot going on. There's a lot of different areas of it. There's the limbic gyrus, there's the intralimbic gyrus, and then there's these other areas which are going to be what are called the fornix. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this other than the fact that I'm going to hit some of the main points, but we're not going to go into all these different specific areas. Let's first start with hippocampus. So let me move my head here. Okay, so the hippocampus is the structure that really is connected to memory. Now you might be asking yourself, why is there a little seahorse next to that weird, gross looking seahorse? Well, the reason why is because this is a hippocampus right here. That's a dissected out hippocampus from a human brain. And this is a seahorse. And the reason why that picture is there, this is an example of one of the few times where they name something based on what it looks like, and it actually looks like that thing. The hippocampus means seahorse. That's what it means. So they named it the hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse. And I gotta say, can't argue with that. But what the job of the hippocampus is it takes short-term memory and consolidates it into long-term memory. And we're going to talk more about memory a little later in this section. But basically, memory, there's different stages of memory. We have short-term memory, and we have long-term memory, and then we have something called working memory, which is that initial stage. Working memory lasts seconds. That's going to be a short amount of time where you can hold information until you put it into short-term memory. So that's basically what you can be doing in the moment, right? Short-term memory is actually only seconds long as well. That's, that doesn't last very long. And then long-term memory, we can really store an limitless amount of information for as long as we want, as long as we rehearse that information. So the hippocampus is responsible for that. And we know that when people have hippocampal damage, what ends up happening is they can't form new memories. They still remember what happened in the past, but they can't form new long-term memories. They will say hi to somebody, turn around, turn back around again, and act like they never saw that person before. So that's going to be the hippocampus. It also has a job in spatial memory. You've probably had this experience before. You wake up in the middle of the night, you have to go to the bathroom or something. You're too lazy to turn the light on, but you can kind of feel yourself there, right? Your eyes are closed or it's so dark you can't see, and you have a general idea of what's going on in the room because you live in that room and you know where to go. That's your hippocampus that's responsible for that as well. So really important part of forming these memories. And we're going to talk more about that a little later on. The next part of the limbic system we're going to focus on is the amygdala. And the amygdala is the emotional center of your brain. So if you take a look at this diagram here, this is the thalamus in the center. Around the thalamus, you have your hippocampus. It wraps around it like so. And at the end of the hippocampus, on each side, we have this little almond-shaped structure. That's what amygdala means. It means almond, actually. And that is the part of the brain which is what we consider our emotional center of the brain. So as you can see, the thalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala are all interconnected to each other. So basically, this is the part that deals with the fear response. So it takes information from the thalamus before it hits the cerebral cortex. And this is pretty interesting. So let me just show you this. I'm not going to hold you responsible for this detail, but I think it's a good detail to know. So there's two routes that information goes when we're talking about basically analyzing it and reacting. There's the short route and there's the long route. Information comes in to the sensory thalamus. So the thalamus is getting all your sensory information. Everything except for the olfactory bulb. So your smell does not go through the thalamus. Your smell actually goes right to the amygdala, which is kind of crazy, and that's why smell is such an important sense. You can react to things way quicker from smell than other senses because it goes right to your amygdala for a response. But before we get to that, let's just talk about this real quick. So you have an emotional stimulus, whatever it is. And again, I'm not talking about like you see a sad movie. I'm talking about you hear a gunshot or you smell fire, something that's going to cause you to react. That information comes into the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it's going to go 2 different routes. It's going to go a short route right to the amygdala. So it goes directly to the amygdala, and you get a response to that. Or it goes the long route, which means it goes up to the cerebrum, to the sensory cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and then it gets to the hippocampus and the amygdala. So what's a good example of that? Perfect example would be you hear a car backfire. Okay, you've all probably heard that before. It's a loud banging noise. It sounds kind of like a gunshot. So that information comes in from your ears. You hear bang, and the first thing you do is you jump, you react, you get anxious, and then you calm yourself down, you think about it, and you go, okay, that was just a car backfiring. That was not a gunshot. There's no guns around here. It was probably a car. You just had 2 different experiences. The first experience was that short route. Your amygdala immediately got accessed and you reacted, your heart rate went up, your eyes widened, you had that fight or flight response just because you heard that loud bang. But at the same time that you heard the bang, you had the message also going to your sensory cortex where it can be interpreted. And you can think about it and you can say, oh wait, this is not a gunshot. It's just a car backfiring. The highway's right there. And the hippocampus is also involved in that because your hippocampus can store memories. So now the next time you hear something that sounds like that, you'll know it's not a gunshot because your hippocampus already has that information. So it's pretty amazing how this system is set up. It's the pathway in which we form memories and we react to stimulus. So the amygdala, very simply, it triggers the hypothalamus to initiate that fight or flight response. So really important system for survival. It's how we know when, danger's coming and what to react to and when to react to it. All right, we're going to finish up with a couple more parts of the diencephalon, and we're going to finish up with 2 that I find very interesting, one more than the other. The pineal gland. The pineal gland is this little pine cone shaped gland that is right in the center of the brain. So it's right here, right really in the middle of the brain, and it's a pine cone shape. That's why it's called pineal. So they name a lot of these glands and structures based off what they look like. And here's what we know about the pineal gland. We know it produces melatonin, and you might take melatonin. A lot of people take melatonin to help them sleep. What it does is it makes you feel sleepy. It's what regulates the sleep cycle. So when the light goes out, you feel tired. So you ever have that teacher turn the lights off so that when they start teaching, and the next thing you know, everyone's just like, oh, falling asleep. And it's not your fault if you fall asleep. Your brain is telling you to sleep. The lights go out. So we actually have a little retina in the back of our pineal gland. And this is really weird, right? So what's a retina? That's what's in the back of your eye. The back of your eye has these rods and cones. You've probably heard of them before. When light hits them, your brain interprets it as an image in your occipital lobe. And those are the receptors. Those rods and cones are the receptors that they distinguish between different wavelengths of light. Well, for some reason that we still don't really know, we have a little retina inside our pineal gland, and that's in the center of our brain. It's probably evolutionary. It's left behind from some other organism that we evolved from that used that, and I'll show a little video clip that explains that a little bit better. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it's weird. It's weird that we have a little eye, and you might have heard the term third eye before. There's a spiritual element to the pineal gland. It's right in the center of our brain. Some people consider it the spiritual center of the brain. You can read up on it. It's interesting. There's some weird stuff. Some of it's interesting. Some of it seems a little ridiculous. But the point I'm making here is that it's a little weird. And that is also the main thing. Here's what we do know that it does. It produces melatonin. And melatonin makes you sleepy. So when the lights go out, that registers, which also makes sense that there's a retina because there's some light that gets picked up from that because light passes through your, UV radiation passes through your skull into your brain, and it could pick that up potentially. And then finally, we have our pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland hangs right off the bottom of your brain. It's actually on the bottom of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is here, and the pituitary gland hangs right off of it. And the pituitary gland is considered the master gland. The hypothalamus tells it what to do. So the hypothalamus is the control center. It picks up information from the blood about your body temperature, about your blood sugar, about all these tired, awake, all this stuff. And then what happens is the pituitary gland is going to regulate all the things that the hypothalamus keeps track of. So it's going to regulate your growth cycle. It's going to produce the human growth hormone, pituitary growth hormone. It's also going to control your reproductive cycles. So that's what triggers puberty, things like that. Pituitary gland and the hypothalamus work hand in hand. So think of the hypothalamus as the boss and the pituitary gland as the worker. It does what the boss says. So just to finish up, the diencephalon has a lot going on, right? The diencephalon is where we're going to have our amygdala, which is the emotional response. It's going to keep us safe in situations of danger. We also have the hippocampus, which is going to be responsible for forming those memories. So, for example, if we go into a room and we're attacked in there, we're going to remember not to go into that room again. That's the hippocampus and the amygdala working together. The thalamus is what sends the information to where it needs to go. So the information comes into the thalamus and then it gets channeled to the hippocampus. It gets channeled to the sensory cortex of the cerebrum, and it gets channeled to the amygdala so you can respond appropriately. And then finally, we have our pineal gland, which is going to be responsible for producing melatonin and controlling our sleep cycles. And lastly, we have our pituitary gland, which is responsible for really doing what the hypothalamus needs it to do. It's going to send out hormones to trigger other hormonal responses. Thank you very much.